tell me what each of these buildings are that are surrounding us?
Okay. We call this church here the Hedrickites, this congregation, and they're still part of the Restoration movement because they consider Joseph Smith to be their founder. But they are the owners of this 2,300 acres I mentioned, which is still part of the Temple Lot property. The temple across the street here is our second temple. It's dedicated to peace. It has a spiral here which replicates a spiral on a seashell. Very impressive, I think. This building is the Mormon Visitor Center. Also, their property goes clear on up the street.
Why are there all of these different branches? There's the RLDS church, then there's the Hedrickites, and then there's the mainstream church. Why were there all those splits?
There were things that was entering into the church that caused a lot of dissension. For instance, the idea of polygamy. This branch of the Restoration movement never complied with polygamy, and the people that did practice polygamy had come from pagan backgrounds.
Carthage, Illinois, 1844. A shot pierced the breast of Joseph Smith, the prophet of the Latter-day Saints. His martyrdom climaxed a decade of persecution against a new group of Christians who were despised for their practice of polygamy. Chased out of Missouri at Independence, far west, and brutally slaughtered at Haun's Mill, the Mormons found themselves without a leader. Even though some believe that Joseph Smith designated his son as the next prophet, Brigham Young claimed to hold the keys to the priesthood and led the majority of the Latter-day Saints westward to an isolated Zion in Utah, where he could institutionalize the practice of polygamy. Despite the fact that the Mormons were isolated in frontier America, it was not long until federal troops arrived to persecute them. In exchange for statehood in the new territory, Wilfred Woodruff, the president and prophet of the Latter-day Saints, issued a manifesto banning polygamy from the faith in 1890. Despite the manifesto and a specific provision in the fledgling state's constitution, many continued living plural marriage and were imprisoned for practicing their beliefs. By the 1930s, the chasm between the mainstream and fundamentalist Mormons had become so wide that the mainstream LDS Church turned on those who followed early church doctrine. Now the church that had previously remained indifferent to polygamists practiced a new policy. If a member were found to be practicing plural marriage in the morning, he or she would be excommunicated by that afternoon. In 1935 and again in 1944, polygamist leaders in Salt Lake City were rounded up and arrested with the blessing of the mainstream church leaders. They were tried, convicted, and jailed for the crime of having more than one wife. In 1953, Arizona Governor Pyle focused his attention on a branch of fundamentalist Mormons in the town of Short Creek on the border of Utah and Arizona. The scars of the raid on Short Creek would stretch across the entire body of fundamentalists. This time, it would not only target the leadership, but all of the men in the community. Awash in confusion and disarray, this previously cohesive group, which had been united in the common principle of celestial marriage, fractured along lines of doctrine and priesthood authority. These fractures pit urban polygamists against rural polygamists in a battle for religious power. Now separate and distinct groups, with their own prophets and religious councils, coalesced throughout the West. Dr. Rulon Allred, who had been imprisoned in 1944 for polygamy, became the prophet of one group in Salt Lake City. Allred's place in fundamentalist history was secured in 1977 when followers of rival prophet Erva LeBaron assassinated him. By spilling the blood of Rulon Allred, the LeBarons believed they were purifying his soul, a practice known as blood atonement. I knew that polygamy had long ago existed in my own Jewish heritage, the 1,000-year ban on its practice having just recently expired. Being a transplant to Utah, the only thing I knew about its polygamy was its infamy, the raids, and the murders. When I became friends with a woman who had lived plural marriage, I wanted to know more about this controversial and taboo relationship. My collaborator and I began with only one question. Are polygamists only serving the commandments of their Heavenly Father, or do the men enslave the women to their dark and insidious desires?